Welcome to Getting Ghosted. This is an Intuitive Soul Collective podcast, and I'm your host, Allie Horner. Welcome back, everyone. I have had some interesting messages coming through, so I want to bring through what I've got, and it feels very much like there are definitely some voices coming through that want to talk about our future as a society, as a species, and as in terms of our technology, our energy. And if you haven't seen on TikTok, I've started doing some jobs of the future and things that will be really common in the next 50 to 100 years. But I'm seeing even to 100 to 200 years out. So I want to talk about some of what's coming and what they want to bring through to me from about 200 years in the future to 250 years in the future. And so the being that I have is saying her name is Anna, and she is actually coming through from the future. She is a living human being about 250 years in the future-ish. She was like, and so I was asking her, what's the actual year then? And she said 2243, 2243. And so she said, my name is Anna. And so I have agreed to channel with her. I was actually starting to hear her a little bit out when I was walking, or not hear, but telepathic connection, which doesn't have a sound, but you notice it in your brain if you're used to channeling it, you're going to notice it. So she said, I want you to understand some of the energetic connections that are happening now between our time frame and your time frame. And she said, there are many of us out here who are just very entrenched in our own lives still. We're still very human 200 years in the future, 250 years in the future. She said, so that humans being humans hasn't changed. We still have greed and corruption, but we have changed a lot of our energetic systems, and there has been a large spiritual awakening and energetic upgrade. And she said it's on a mass scale, but it's not quite to the point where you would be like dumbfounded by it. She said many people in your world who don't believe in intuition or psychic ability or telepathy would absolutely think it's too far-fetched. But there are more people who are able to engage in such things in our time frame where it's become more common. And she said, now not everyone uses it, but it is more common in our time frame. She said it actually became so common that we had to start to create some rules and regulations around it. And she winked at me, and I thought to myself, that's so interesting, because I've wondered about this, like, with the surge of psychics and mediums and, all of the scammy bots. Like, for example, I have my Spirit Speaker 25 TikTok account, and I get messages all the time from people going, I'm getting messages from someone who's saying they're you. Is that you? And I'm like, nope, we will never message you. Like, first, like that. That's not how we work. And there are tons of imposter accounts, and it's like scammers and bots and things like that. And we have no control over that. Like, but they exist on every platform, and TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, everywhere. So you have to be really careful about it. And there's not much the original creator can do. And so anyway, I've even tried to report one or two that didn't have me blocked, and I couldn't get their accounts taken down. So anyway, so she said, so I want you to understand that there were a lot of rules and regulations that have been created over time, and it's not going to happen quite in your time frame, but it will happen soon enough. And she said, this was a really important piece because as the energetic systems sort of flip on your planet, and she's showing moving toward more clean energy. There is more energetic upgrades that happen within the human consciousness also as a result. And she said, now these two things are connected, and we discovered this along the way, but it's not something that we would have been able to that you would have been able to anticipate. And she said, because they're connected in a way of frequency and sound and light, and how your current energetic systems work is they kind of somewhat dull that down for a lot of people. She said, so some of the technology you have, though brilliant in many ways, is still sort of rudimentary. And she said, now, I do want to talk about the clean energy revolution that's happening. And she said, there will be more jobs in this indeed. And so I was asking her, like, what types of jobs do you guys have around that energy industry 200 years in the future? And she said, well, renewables and clean energy was a really large movement out of necessity. She said, because of atmospheric changes for you. And she said, not all in your current year of 2026, but in the near future. She's showing anywhere from 10 to 50-ish years out from now, that there would be atmospheric changes. And she said, you're already seeing them. Some of them are more obvious. Some people who have high pattern recognition or strong psychic ability already know what we're talking about. Very sensitive people know what we're talking about. And she said, now the other piece is I want you to understand that there is more psychic ability available, but it's going to be connected to the renewable energy revolution. And I was like, that's very interesting. I was like, tell me more, say more about that, please. And she said, I understand you're asking that as a question, but for me, it's more of a matter of fact statement. And I said, so you want me to phrase that more as though I'm asking a question rather than going say more. And she said, yes, less of a statement, more of a question. And I said, okay, cool. Got it. And so she said, this is more part and parcel of how we communicate here and now as well. And she said, there's other energetic upgrades that will be coming that will help you to navigate the changing spiritual awakenings and changes in your systems. But as people go through some of the awakenings, you will see some mental health crises. So there will be a special field of holistic healthcare that deals with these types of awakenings where they understand this person's they don't deserve a label of she's showing like bipolar, and she's looking at some of these diagnoses we have as though she's saying they just don't exist to the same degree that we understand things in the future. So the labels on things have changed because we understand them better. And she said, so there's going to be larger and larger waves of spiritual awakening that happen because of the frequency and energy, sound and light happening on the planet. And she said, this created a large chasm for us. We saw many people struggling with these energies. And so there became a larger field of study that opened up and became very widespread, which actually was not about diagnosing these people with something, some disease. And she said, and then just treating the symptoms which is what you do in your past time frame. She said that we just a lot of our mental health care, everything's very siloed and they only treat symptoms. And she said, yes, exactly. And then she said, so in our future timeframes, we have learned a lot more about what's been going on. And so there was a period of time where the energetic systems upgraded both body, mind, and soul and across the planet. And it wasn't all at once. It's an evolution. But she's saying, what began to happen is we started to realize that there needed to be a larger field dedicated to helping people with awakenings and people who understand the energetic systems at play. They understand frequency. They also understand how the body operates. They understand vitamin and mineral deficiencies and needs. They're looking at holistic healthcare. They're understanding that this is that some people are going through energetic awakenings, and that they don't need just, she said, in your time frame, she said, we understand, we have compassion for this from our perspective out in the future. We understand historically why this was the way it was. But many of you have a philosophy in your time periods of just, there's a pill for that. You just give a medication and treat the symptoms, and you don't look at the underlying causes. We understand much more now because we started to understand what was happening. It's one of those things where there began to be a larger field of study around the spiritual awakening and consciousness shift and how that impacted a lot of people. And she said there were some people who really struggled. There were some people also who were kind of the shepherds guiding the flock, who learned their lessons the hard way, who were able to help integrate some of this for the rest of the collective and people who were going through it. And there were also many children who were born in the years 2050 to 2179, she's showing me. So quite a large window. And she said, and some even earlier, but many of them began to come in around the 2050s who were much more energetically aware and aligned and capable and able to handle the energetic frequencies at play. They were also part of a cultural revolution because they are much more aware. Now, some of them still have their growing pains. And she said, for all intents and purposes, they were very normal kids, but they just have more psychic awareness. They're more sensory. Many of them are more clairvoyant and they see sounds. As she's showing, what she said, what you would call synesthesia in your time period. We no longer really have a label for that out in the future. She said, in our time period, we understand synesthetes to be wonders. And I was hearing the song 7 Wonders by Fleetwood Mac in my mind. And she said, we're very much still human. Like everyone's very much still human. And I asked her, how old are you? And she said, I'm 39. And I said, oh, I'm 40. And she just goes, I know. I was like, okay. But she said, so for all intents and purposes, a lot is still the same, but much has changed at the same time. Like we're still very human. But there are certain things that have come online. She said, no, I asked her, now, so is everyone psychic? And she goes, well, from what we understand, everyone has psychic awareness and psychic ability, but not everyone chooses to perceive it. I asked her, is this taught in schools? And she said, yes, in many schools of thought, it's become more common knowledge to teach to the psychic awareness, to listen to the body wisdom, to notice when electromagnetic pulses are happening up the spine, to not diagnose such criteria with some sort of, here's a label for that, here's a medication, let's put you in a hospital. We have different energetic upgrades and systems now for mental health and healthcare. In fact, we see them in the same system. They're not separate here. And I was like, that's such a relief. And she just said, I know, because it's like a telepathic connection between us. And then she's showing me, yes, there are sound healers and energetic healers here, but also many of our hospital systems, we are much more engrossed in preventative medicine. And I said, okay, so what's that look like? And she said, well, as the frequency changes, as the energetic systems on Earth upgrade, and she said, we mean not just energetic systems like the frequency on Earth and consciousness and these types of things, which have become more common knowledge for us out in the future. She's saying the actual renewable field of renewable energy moving into more of she's saying the renewable energy systems really caused quite a big deal of energy to be freed up on Earth. They changed the air quality. They changed the temperature. They changed the ground soil. They changed erosion patterns. Everything is interconnected. And I said, yeah. And she's showing me images at the same time. Things that she just learned in school. It's like basic knowledge. I'm like, neat. we're learning certain things about this stuff, but not all of it. And she said, so this is something that for us it's become so much more widespread. And she said, we do have energetic devices as well that create more of this renewable energy within the home. So we are still upgrading and learning more and more about these systems even in our time frame. But she said they become much more prominent in the future, and there is a large number of the energetic systems that had to be upgraded, but they found it was much easier to upgrade them and simply almost like turn off the taps for these older systems, so we say. And so she's showing people literally just turning off a faucet or turning off, it looks like a pipe, turning off a pipe. And she said, and we work a lot more with different forms of renewable technology that would not exist in your vocabulary yet there. But she said it works with light and sound. And so as this changed, so did our ability to develop technology that could heal people and work as preventative medicine. So these things that have been helping to clean up the air and water for a very long time have genuinely also helped in terms of preventing a lot of illness, because there's a lot of illness because of she's showing sound waves and frequency waves that come from our technology and from atmospheric issues and from, she said it's like something that people who are really sensitive can hear, like how some people can hear LED lights and they feel sick around them, kind of like that. And she said, yes, that's an example of a technology that goes away because you start to realize this is not helpful. This is harmful for people. There's many things in your timeline that are more harmful and are doing more harm than good. So in the future, we have developed new ways to work with different technology and work with the energetic systems that also allow us to, they're showing, she said there's more nutrients in the soil, and she's showing energetic systems like people placing hands in the soil. There's these like devices that they can wave over the soil and they're reading it. And it looks like things we might have today, like almost like an app on a phone, but it's different. It's like something that's connected to their hand and they're waving it and it's reading things. But she said, but we don't only use technology to grow plants. We grow them ourselves. We have time every day. Everyone has their own gardens and plants and they grow these gardens. These are for us to eat, and we do energy work with them. And also the changes in our atmospheric pressure, the air quality, the water quality, the soil quality, the light here, it's changed. And she said the light is ever so slightly, But the frequency changes have made it much easier for many people to grow their own food. And I said, so one of the downloads I have gotten about the future in my past channelings was that we were going to see a big revolution in meat eating pretty soon. And she said, yes, that is going to happen pretty quickly for you in your time frame if nothing large changes. And she said, at this point in time, there's nothing large that can happen that's going to really throw off this collective energy to this point. But it's almost like it's like, hey, this ball's already really rolling, it's already snowballed. She said, but essentially meat eating is almost non-existent for us in the future. When people do partake in it, they get very sick. They're very ill. And she said, some cultures do eat meat and it's more like tradition or ritual. But there's a lot of cleansing processes and unique processes to that. But many people's energetic systems, the energetic systems at play with the type of energy and technology that we do use in the future requires that we don't factory farm animals in the same ways that you do on Earth. It's actually quite cruel. And she said, it's also terribly bad for the environment and for the energetic systems at play. And it makes people quite sick, and many people don't know how sick they're getting because of the factory farming processes that are going on Earth and the lack of clean eating on Earth. She said it's very hard to eat clean in your time frame because there is a lack of freshly grown fruits and vegetables that have nutrients. And I was asking her, is this like the book, The Celestine Prophecy? And she looked at me kind of funny and she said, The Celestine what? And I said, oh, okay, it's a book that exists in my time frame. And she goes, and she's writing down and something. She said, I'll have to look into it. And I said, do you have books? And she goes, oh, we delight in books. And I was like, thank God. And she kind of laughed and giggled a little bit. And I said, do you guys still have religion? And she said, oh yes, there's many people who still have religions. But it's not quite the same. Like, people are allowed to practice and believe what they want. There's more tolerance. There isn't as much of a warfare, but she said there are some people who still use things like that for greed or control, but a lot of that was revealed a long time ago. And there's a lot more, she said, like cultural interference with that now, where things aren't getting as out of hand, but they're still kind of there. So I said, so was there one religion that kind of took over? Because some people are saying that. I don't see that coming personally. And she said, that's because that won't happen. There isn't one thought system that dominates all. There's more of an energetic and consciousness change that has begun to happen, but it's not widespread all the way yet. Like, not everyone's on top of that. But she is going back to the fruits and vegetables again. She said, now going back, these fruits and vegetables are really beautiful. And we started to recognize them as energetic counterparts, beings. And she said, when we're eating the right types of foods, and she said, I assume this is mentioned in your book. And I said, well, I'm wondering, I think it might be where you're going. So she said, well, the types of fruits and vegetables we found that their nutrition is healthier. They're healthier, much better because of the changes that I mentioned in the air and soil and water. But there is also a different quality in them because the frequency and the evolutionary process that was allowed to take hold, it wasn't forced. It wasn't mass produced. We didn't force the evolution. Some people did try, and there are companies who tried to do that for a while in your time frame. But in the future, many people just simply grow their own. It's seen as part and parcel of being in the group, in the culture, that people have their own gardens. We even have time during the day to tend to the garden, and we eat largely vegetarian diets. We eat fruits and vegetables and different seeds. And she said, we have much more connection to the earth this way, but it's not that every and anyone does this. This is just more common. And she said, there are also food pods that have begun to be built in certain areas because of the melting of the ice. She's showing me the North and South Pole, the ice melts and the glacier melts. She said, yes, there was a lot of melting and much of it wasn't reversible, but we started to realize that this was kind of a natural part of the progression. There wasn't an ability to go back. And so she said, so as this began to happen, some of the Earth's energetic processes and weather systems began to change. Obviously, so in some areas of the world, there are pods needed to be able to grow food, year round. And these pods are quite important because they protect the Earth's energy and as well from either scorching sunlight or freezing cold temperatures. And she said, I said, so was there this mass flooding along the coast that a lot of us have been seeing in the Great Lakes and stuff like that? And she said, oh, yes. And she said there's a lot of soil erosion in certain areas. And there were many areas that began to go completely underwater. And she said, and so there was some history that was lost, but there were also other areas that became really fertile because of this that previously would not have been able to be fertile, that would not have been able, they would have been more desert-like or kind of more the plains, very dry. And she said, for instance, in parts of Colorado, there were some dust bowl conditions almost that came about. And she said, she was telling me, she said, I'm not as well educated on that. I didn't learn as much about that in my learning in my school systems. And she said, but I could read up on it to give you more information later. And I was like, okay. So it's clear where she's located. She's not learning as much about Colorado's culture from where she is. Maybe it's not as relevant. She said, well, yes, in my educational system, that was just not as much of an area of focus. And I said, well, what was your system focused on? What did you learn in school? Like what? And she said, well, she kind of giggled a little bit and she said, school. And she said, we still have schools. Yes. We still have educational systems, but they're more autonomous. And some people, there are lots of in-classroom learnings, but it's more like you're gathering for certain times of the day to perform experiments, to play, and to create things together like group projects. And community-driven learning is really common and really popular, but there are also individual learning experiences that are very important. And she's showing her learning about energy. And she said, that was my track. That was my path that I was on. And I asked her, so in the future, did you get to choose that? Or was that like assigned? And she said, there are some areas where that's assigned. She said, there are some cultures who do it a little bit more that way still. And there's some cultures where they say, well, what do you feel drawn toward? What are you interested in? And she said, I said, can people choose to move to a different place if they don't agree with the way that their culture does their education? She said, oh, yes. And I was like, so are there things about going from country to country? And she goes, well, we still have things that are connected to me. She's showing something being scanned to go into different countries. She said, it's more for tracking purposes, but not control. And she said, there isn't, like, we have different countries in different areas and provinces and states, but it's very different. And we don't have as much of that control dynamic around it. We don't focus as much on, don't climb over our wall, stay out of our country. It's not really like that as much anymore because there were certain natural events and things that happened with the energy systems on Earth over time in the last 200 years that caused us to have to be, one for all and all for one, where we had to really advocate for humanity as a whole, where everyone had to band together versus being nationalistic. And I said, and you mean like, being like, defend my country against other countries, even though those are people too. And she said, exactly. That began to fade away largely due to lack of resources and due to lack of patriarchal norms. And she's showing more equality between systems and races. And she said it was found that there were certain races and certain countrymen and women and peoples rather who were much more advanced technologically than we had suspected before. And there were also certain, she's saying the word shapeshifters, who came to our planet, who began to, she said they gave us technology, but it was given with great care. And it was given to the right people at the right times. And she's showing people being visited by different other people who had this awareness of how this technology could work. Almost like she said, you know what I speak of. And I said, I was just thinking of a movie where they gave different people pieces of a puzzle. Like aliens came and they gave people, and she giggled at the word aliens the second I say it. And she was like, we don't call them aliens anymore. And she goes, that's rather politically incorrect now. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. And she said, it's all right. We understand. And I said, what do you call them? And she said, well, we call them multidimensional beings. And I said, oh, okay. We kind of use that language, but it's not very well known outside of the spiritual circles. And she also, again, giggled at the spiritual circles thing. She said, well, of course, we understand what spirituality is from your time frame, but it's quite rudimentary compared to what we. I was like, okay, got it. Interesting. And she said, and she was telling me, go on. So I was talking to her basically about the movie Arrival. And I said, so these multidimensional beings came down in ships in the movie, in the film, and they gave people different pieces of a universal language. And so, spoiler alert for anyone, sorry if you guys haven't seen it yet. But essentially, people realize from different countries they have to work together to put this together, or they won't be able to interpret it and understand it. And as they interpret it, it warps their perception of time and space. And it changes how it's essentially like a dimensional shift opener. And she said, yes. And she said, I like this concept. And she said, I have not seen that film. I have not seen that movie, but I will watch that later today. She's making notes on things I'm talking about. Like she's curious about things that have happened during our time frame that she was like, I can only study so much in school. And I mean, you have to think about it. Like some of the things I'm mentioning are 200 years in the past for her. So like, it's not like we've read every single piece of literature from 200 years ago in our time frame, like we know a lot of things, but we haven't read every book from that time period. Like we haven't read every letter. We don't know about every film. Like it kind of makes sense that she's like, oh, I'll have to, I need to watch that. I need to look that up. I'm going to have to go. She said, I'm going to have to go to our archive system. I was like, love it. I love feeling old. And she kind of laughed and she smirked and said, well, in your time frame where you don't live as long, you would be considered middle-aged almost. And I'm like, great, because I'm 40. And she said, in my time frame, I'm not quite middle-aged yet because our average lifespan is over 100 years old. But not all people live to that length. There are still accidents. There are still technological changes that we're working on to help to understand a healthy long lifespan versus just a longer lifespan. Some people live longer but don't always have as much health, though we have a lot more preventative medicine now to help health and longevity. So, for example, we don't have many more illnesses that would prevent us from living that long or make our bodies age as quickly. And I was like, that's really interesting. And she goes, yes, but we still do grow old. We still do have certain things, but we have better advances that allow us to kind of like move around them. So like autoimmune sort of starts to fade away. Arthritis, things like that start to go away. And she said, we also have better treatments for them now. And we take more care with preventative medicines, but there's less of that. Yes. She said also, for your time frame, and for the sake of what I was saying about the multidimensional beings, they did come and bring information to different people sort of telepathically throughout time. And she said this happened over a collection of decades. And they were visiting different people in different parts of the world, people that they knew they could trust with the intelligence. And they gave these people different downloads and pieces of information. And then these people, some of them began to get to work right away because they were engineers and scientists and things like that. And some of them were people who were in remote communities who didn't touch as much technology, or they didn't have as much access to that, but they did have an ability to send wavelengths out of receptivity to others. So strong meditators or guides. And some of them were meant to share what they downloaded or what they knew or what the conversations they had with other people who then would begin to implement it. But many people had to come together over time to build out and understand more of this technology. So it was purposefully not given to everyone all at once. So there was not one big reveal. And she said, I want you to understand that about the age of disclosure, as we call it in our history books now. And I said, do you have to read history books, or do you have, she said, oh yes, but we have archive systems that we can pull up as well. But we like the touch of paper. We like the feel of different materials. We found a way to make synthetic paper so we no longer have to tear down trees, by the way. I said, that makes me feel better because I feel guilty about buying books sometimes, but I love books. And she said, oh yes, we like to read very much. And we absorb material quite quickly because our consciousness processes are not as hindered, but we still enjoy reading and we still generally learn much in the same ways, though our technology has changed and our minds are a little bit clearer as our energetic systems. So there's been changes there. And I asked her, now back on the subject of disclosure, there wasn't a big event. She said, no, this was more given in small places and ways over time through multidimensional beings who can shapeshift. She said, I don't want anyone to feel alarmed. They were perfectly peaceful beings. They did not harm anyone. But there were people who were very scared or alarmed by them because they didn't understand what they were. And because their frequency is so high, it feels very sometimes calming to the human body and sometimes kind of jarring for the human body to come in contact with that electrical frequency. She said, sort of like if you stuck your finger in a light socket, or if you came too close to a storm beginning and you started to feel your hair stand on end from the static electricity and you could feel it in your body. I went, yes, I understand what you mean. They tell us to get off the mountain if you are even thinking that you're close to that. If you feel static electricity when you're hiking and you're like, oh, that storm looks far away. No, you need to go. You need to get out of there. And she said, exactly. So it's the energy that people are feeling, a literal energy. And they're unaware that this can cause you to feel strange in your body and upset. So it kind of messed with their minds and psychologically. So they said that there was something to be afraid of, but that's not necessarily the case. And she said also, we understand a lot more about the mental health systems and how different frequencies impact mental health systems now than you did then. She said there's still more to learn for us, but we understand much more now. So again, we understand now that these shapeshifter or multidimensional beings rather came down, and we work with them quite well in our time periods, though not everyone has contact with them or works with them. But there's much more comfort with that concept now. And we know that they have worked with us for certain technological advances, and implementation of different energy sources has been very helpful. But she said, but it's not like they're here all the time and like have taken over and saved us. She said, but they have helped greatly, and we're very grateful to them. I was asking her, have you had contact? And she said, oh, yes. And I said, well, what was your contact like? And she said, telepathic for the most part. And she said, but I have had, contact with different beings because I work in the energy sector. And she said, because of my work, it aligns with their higher interests for them to help us navigate this well. And she said, they have helped us with some of our earthly systems, though they largely keep hands off of things. They don't get too engrossed in our day-to-day life. They just have helped with certain things for us over time. And I said, that's really neat to think about. I just love that has been happening. The other piece, she said, that I want you to receive quite well, and I'm hoping that I can trust you to hear this. And she said, I want you to understand that the energetic systems needed adaptation. So some people were not quite ready for the spiritual awakenings that happened, as I said. And so there began to be a growing field of study around the electromagnetic field. It became much more widespread and not seen as so woo-woo or out there. And she put that in air quotes. And she said, so over time, what began to happen is people began to understand their own multidimensionality. So as these multidimensional beings began to come in, there was less of a shockwave, though at the time period they started to come in, it was still quite shocking for many. And as the information came out, many people were much more ready for it. And so it became, she said, there was a lot of folklore, as you would call it then, that sort of helped people to prepare mentally and psychologically for it. And then she said, so these beings helped a lot with Earth's energetic systems and the upgrades. And she said, and also AI, we have a lot more AI technology that's more integrated. She said, we have been very much implementing it, and we see how well it can work when used correctly. And she said, we do learn about AI and how it came about as part of our education. And that's pretty widespread, and it's pretty easy to access and understand that or read about that. And she said, essentially, you don't need to be so scared of it, which she said, my guess is that you understand this now. And I was like, yeah, I don't use it as much because of, I don't really use it at all because of the water systems and stuff like that. Like there's concerns around that. And she said, oh yes, that was a big problem they had to clean up. But they did figure out how to use this well and how to clean up those systems. And she said, and so essentially there are many things we have now that you as a psychic might have received from your guides or your teachers. And she said, or from other multidimensional beings who came through to give you intelligence to give to other people so that they wouldn't be scared of AI. And she said, we don't use it in the same way that many of you are. Like, we don't ask it every little thing. We think for ourselves. We understand how important that is. But it is very instrumental for people in our time frame who have disabilities. She said, though we don't have as many of those anymore, they still do exist. And she said, it also is very instrumental in the healthcare field. It's very instrumental in certain areas, like diagnosing certain things where the human mind might not be aware of certain things yet. And so she's showing AI technology scanning the body. And she said, I said, is that something, do you guys have insurance? Like, does that cost a lot of money? And she said, well, there are still people who have a lot more wealth than other people here, that there is still greed, there is still corruption, yes. But she said that hasn't fully gone away. That's, she said, but it's much less prominent now. And it does exist, but it's much less prominent. We understand it more. And we're much more, many of us on average are more generous and live in less of the lack or scarcity that you do. And she said, because there's much more abundant farming processes and programs, and we don't think about our work-life balance the same way that you do. We don't think about money in this sense. And she said, so there's much better systems now with this, but essentially our AI technology is more of like, it can help us with certain things in health, medical, even mental health fields. She said it's much more advanced now, but it's not, she said it's somewhat integrated into everyday life, but it hasn't taken over the things that are important to us. We don't have, like she said, you used to call them deep fakes. We don't have that anymore. And she said, we do much more conversing and we have much more communal living now. And she said, this was very important for us because we needed to have closer family systems and family ties. We needed to have systems in place and cultural change and movements, which happened more organically. They weren't forced. They happened organically. And she said, your time period, you produced much of this. You produced many of these time periods or this movement. But there was a change, partially because of housing developments and things like that, but partially because of many of the political and infrastructure changes you're having, in which many people started to live more communally, and they started to shift into hub style living, where it's almost like little mini neighborhood ecosystems with much more pedestrian walking and care and communal gardening and cleaner and living. And she said, now this wasn't all overnight. It happened over, decades, but I'm seeing like 20 years. And she said, and even more for certain parts, but she said there's much more multi-generational living in our time frame out in 200 years in your future. But it's essential that you understand that you began these changes, and some of what's going on in your time frames caused some of these shifts for us. And she said there is also a great healing that took place with intergenerational family systems. And there was a lot more healing that took place in terms of mental health care over time. And she said, no, over time. And she's spanning her arms out like long time, like this didn't happen overnight. And she said, so we understand in your time frame, you might think, well, for many people that, living intergenerationally, having, several generations living within a family home together would be really tough on their mental health and their physical health. And she said, that is still the case for some people here. And so people aren't required to do that. But it's much more common because there has been a great healing that's taken place between the generations. Now, again, this isn't the same as, there. And she said, but there isn't the same expectation that a child should move out immediately upon turning, upon graduation. And there isn't the expectation that once you're an adult, you're on your own. There's also no expectation that you must stay. She said it's very different. And so she said, so there's been almost this sort of like coming together. And she said also there's much more community style living. So homes that have their own living spaces and living rooms and things like that. But then they have some communal kitchens, and so interesting. And she said they have a communal garden, they have activities. These would be more like larger family systems and groups of friends, and people they would invite in, acquaintances and neighbors, or people that they think would be a good fit for the larger community, where it's a very large group of people living together, and they might even have smaller homes. And she said they're structured differently in different parts of the world. And so in some areas, they might live in more of like smaller homes and then come together to cook and eat and play when they want to, and even have schooling systems and things like that within them. They spend a lot of time together because that's what they want. She said, and I said, so are there people who still have their own homes? Like, it's like we're a nuclear family. And she said, oh yes, but that's just not as common. And it's not as thought of as the right way to live, because she said multi-generational housing has become much more prevalent because it's much more affordable. And she said, everyone pooling their resources is much healthier and much more helpful. And she said, but we also don't have to use as much of our money on healthcare. So there's been a very big change there. And she said, I understand this is hard to conceive of for many of you there, because you're like, I can't imagine living with, an abusive, parent, or I can't imagine living with, a certain sibling that we're just, very opposite of each other. And she said, and sure, there are still some, we are still humans in the future. Like, there's still differences of opinion and things like that. But overall, there's been a large cultural change of this community style living. And she said much of your generation and the things happening in your time period over the next 20 to even 50 years was a large part of that change. You're already seeing it. And I was like, that's actually true. Like, I've been thinking about this. We're seeing some changes where I'm like, I don't think we can go on like this with our housing. I think a lot of people are going to be moving back into like multi-generational living. Like, my guides have been kind of showing it, and creating like family compounds, and like, there are more and more of these communities popping up, like what she was describing. And she said, oh yes, those are just the beginning. It's started to really start during your lifetime. And I was like, that's really interesting. I think I'm going to pause here, and I'll bring her back through, and we'll maybe do a part 2. So just because I know this is getting a little long, and she just kind of said, yes, thank you. And she said, my third eye is getting a little sore. So I'm going to give her a little bit of a break too. And she said, I need to go out in my garden. And she's showing me her gloves, and she's got her gloves. And she said, she was showing me, she puts her hands in the soil and closes her eyes and breathes. And she says, like that. So maybe a little sign to us of how we could maybe start to do these things too. Now, I have to say, this is not the first time I've seen an image like this in the last couple of weeks. So I just want to mention that too. Thank you all for listening. I hope that you're enjoying this. If you want me to do another part, just let me know, in the comments on Patreon when it gets posted, or submit your story or your questions using the link in the little bio area or in the show notes area. And I wanted to mention as well, I do have channeling courses coming up. If you want to learn how to lucid channel or clear conduit channel like this, you are welcome to come and join the Art of Channeling. It's the intermediate to advanced level. So it will not be a beginner level course for that one, but you will learn how to lucid channel, and we'll start to bridge into some beginner trance channeling in that, where you get to learn how to actually let it could be people like Anna from the future. It could be guides and loved ones. It could be, ideas and concepts as they clear conduit channel or lucid channel through you, where you're starting to move out of the way more and more and more. And then I will teach you how to do that. That's something I've been doing for about 10 years. And then I also have another one opening up, and it's going to be called the Art of Auto Writing. And auto writing is also a channeling process. It's just through writing. So if that is something that you're interested in, and you want to bring through messages, if you think that you want to bring through lucidly channeled messages for a podcast, to do readings of your own, to start your own channeling content, you are welcome to come and join us. Or if you're wanting to channel, through writing for whatever reason, you just feel compelled, you want to do written messages, or you think you might want to be writing a book or poems or songs, like Michael Jackson used to wake up in the middle of the night and get an inspiration on a song, and then he would sit down and auto write it all out. That's a form of auto writing. So even if you're like, I'm not sure what I would end up writing, I just know that sounds really cool. Like I really feel like called to learn that. come and join us, because the art of auto writing will be great for people who are just starting out or for people who are more well seasoned. And the art of channeling, that course will be much more intermediate to advanced. But if you feel compelled to join both of them, you can. The way that I'm going to run the courses, you'll be able to join either one. So check those out. Those will be linked up in the show notes here shortly. And stay up to date by subscribing on Patreon or joining the Patreon groups or subscribing to my email list, because they'll be the first ones to find out. Both of these experiences too, they're not just courses, they're kind of like mentorships. So a lot of if you know me, I'm a very experiential learner. So a lot of live classes. I'm going to put some recorded lessons in there as well. I'm already starting to work on them. And then so that you have lessons to watch on your own time as well. And then we'll also have some live classes, live practice sessions. You'll get to share your channelings. You'll get to practice together. It's going to be a lot of fun. So I hope you guys will come and join us. Thank you all so much for listening.